Hi, this is Mark Littleton, the minister of the Word for the Athens Church of Christ, with today's 3-minute sermon. We're wrapping up our study of the Gospel of John this week, and every day on our 3-minute sermon for April and the first week of May, we've been looking at a chapter in John's Gospel and picking out a particular text in that chapter to get some application from for our lives. Today we come to John chapter 18. We are nearing the end of Jesus' earthly life. We're moving closer and closer to the cross of Calvary. In John 18, Jesus is arrested, and eventually he stands trial before Pilate. And there's so much there in the interchange between Jesus and Pilate that is just so interesting. I would encourage you to get your Bible today and read the entire chapter. But what I want to focus on today is Peter's role in this chapter. You may remember that Jesus had told Peter previously, when Peter made this bold statement, that even if everyone else turned their back on him, that Peter never would desert Jesus. And Jesus told him, Peter, you're not only going to desert me, but before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. Peter vehemently said, never, Lord, I would never do that. Well, then you come to John 18, beginning down in verse 15. It says, Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty, and brought Peter in. You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you? She asked Peter. He replied, I am not. It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they'd made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. Down in verse 25, it says, Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there, warming himself. And so they asked him, You aren't one of his disciples, are you? He denied it, saying, I am not. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. Didn't I see you with him in the garden? And Peter denied it. And in that moment, a rooster began to crow. Peter said, Lord, I will never deny you. But he did. How many times have we failed the Lord? In spite of our best intentions, in spite of all of the things that we would say, that we would never allow ourselves to fail him, and yet we have failed him. For many of us, that failure in our past, that moment in our past becomes something we just get stuck in and we cannot move past it. Listen, what I want you to hear me say today is for Peter, and we're going to see this when we get to John 21 on Friday, but for Peter, his failure here was not final. This was not the last chapter in his book. And your failure doesn't have to be final either. It doesn't have to be the final chapter. Let Jesus deal with your failure if you'll just bring that thing to him. Lord willing, tomorrow we'll see you for another 3-minute sermon. God bless.